Groundhog Day, take 4. Okay, no, I refuse. I refuse to let maddening frustration and repetition get the best of me. I'm having a gremlin day. And what I mean by that is that technology is behaving in ways that are puzzling and frustrating to me. Maybe this is my disalignment in my own energy. Okay. Anyway, so you're going to get two more videos, several more videos. You're going to get a bunch of videos. It's going to be like a blooper reel of videos. Amazing. I just tried switching to different equipment and figured I'd get myself set up on my phone. It's a pretty nice machine. Problem, filmed me in HD, so I hit a limit at about 25 minutes. So here we go. All right, let's wrap this up. I have to do this, then I gotta go pick up my dry cleaning, then I gotta be back for 6. I've been doing this all day. Okay, where did we leave off? I think maybe it cut me off at the very end of that last video. So we were talking about the psychodynamic hypothesis. Okay, so the point is that, again, psychodynamic hypothesis, you are not a singular unitive being, right? You have parts. Okay, now, part of the sort of supposition there, okay, that's really important when we're talking about the psychodynamic theorists of the 20th century is also the unconscious. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the unconscious? Okay, well, one confusion people get into is that when we're talking about the unconscious, that we're talking about unconsciousness, right? Like being knocked out, right? That's not strictly speaking true. Sometimes you'll have heard the term the subconscious, okay? And that actually has some technical usage, so it's not quite right. So what are we talking about? Okay, so it is the case that, like, have you ever had a memory come back to you, right? You know, there's a famous moment in Proust, okay, the author Proust. He dips a cookie in some tea, a Madeleine in some tea. He puts it in his mouth and boom, all of a sudden he has this flood come back to him, memories of, right, eating these cookies as a kid. Certain kinds of foods will get this, smells will get this. You'll have these moments where all of a sudden it comes flooding back at you, right? Christmas cookies, in my experience, very often have this kind of effect for people, right? Okay, where was that material? Well, within psychodynamic theories, the answer that you would get, typically speaking, is it's in the unconscious, which is to say not you're knocked out unconscious, but rather that it's passed outside the normal sphere of your awareness, right? It comes back to you. You're like, oh my, I forgot about that, right? I forgot about that. Okay, similarly, if you've ever had the experience where you know something, but you kind of can't get it into your consciousness, like you have a word on the tip of your tongue. Incidentally, every time I have that experience, every time, the thing that I remember first, I'm trying to remember a word, whatever it is, and the word that I'll remember instead is the word lethologica, which is the word that means not being able to remember a word. Lethe, forgetting, like the river Lethe in Greek mythology, logica, right? Like from word. So forgetting word, lethologica. So I'll forget a word, I won't be able to bring it to mind, and the first thing my brain will do is go, lethologica, and I'll be like, yes, thank you. I know what the term is, but that's not what I'm looking for. And then what happens? You've all had this experience, you're not thinking about it, you relax, whatever, and then at 2 in the morning, all of a sudden you're like, damn it, zeugma, that was the word. Okay, so where was it? When you couldn't access it, it was still in your mind in some way, but you couldn't get it into consciousness. You couldn't get it into the spotlight where you could actually see it. Okay. So depending on your particular psychodynamic orientation, okay, you may have different views of the unconscious. For the Freudians, the unconscious is largely a repository for sort of repressed and forgotten information. For Jung and for some other psychodynamic theorists, it's more than that. So there are other sort of things within the unconscious. But for now, you know, just bear this in mind. Okay, that it's about things that pass out of consciousness, but they're still part of the operations of your mind, even though you're not aware of them directly. Now, in a way, that's not terribly hard to understand. There are all kinds of things that support your functionality as a being that you do not have awareness of. So for instance, because we have speech, right, we can exert conscious awareness over our breathing, right? Because we normally control it for language. But most of the time, you're not aware of that at all. Right? And indeed, right, if you try to monkey around with your breathing, right, your unconscious breathing will reassert itself to preserve you, right? Your body is very no nonsense about this. So if you've ever seen somebody try to like hold their breath to, you know, kids will like hold their breath to knock themselves out kind of thing. And, you know, this is why nobody can die by holding their breath. You can die by choking. You could obscure the right passageway or something, but you can't die by holding your breath. You hold your breath, right? Consciousness is like, that's it. And then eventually when you pass out, the rest of the system unconsciously takes over and it's like, yeah, okay, let's back to regularly scheduled programming. Let's breathe. Likewise, you're very seldom aware of your heart. Your heart is operating unconsciously, right? Now, if your heart is pounding, right, if you're in a lot of stress or fear or you're exercising really heavily, you may become aware, right, that your heart is operating. But the fact is you don't typically have conscious access to that, right? You don't know. Your heart's going right now. What's it doing? Right? Now, you can, interestingly, get conscious access to it through a process called biofeedback. That's something we'll talk about a little bit down the line. But the point is, right, that's not a process that you normally have conscious access to. Okay, now think about these processes. When's the last time you made conscious contact with your bone marrow? How about your endocrine system, your immune system, digestion, right? These are all processes that are like integral, part and parcel of everything that's going on with you. You know, metabolism. You don't have conscious access to that. You expect that it's going to run on its own. Well, likewise, one of the things you can consider in the unconscious is the processes that constitute and operate your mind. So to use a metaphor, you know, if you imagine like a stage, right? There are the people who are in the wings. These are the people that operate the ropes, they tune the lights, right? They do the makeup. They do all this stuff to make, you know, what's happening on stage operate, but they're never on stage, right? Okay, but then on stage, there, you know, let's say there's a spotlight. There might be figures walking in and out of that spotlight, right? And the spotlight is like a consciousness, you know? In some ways, the spotlight metaphor of consciousness is problematic, but for our purposes here, it'll suit. Which is to say that, you know, you have something in your consciousness at any given time, right? Or not all the time, but, you know, if you have something in your consciousness, but there are other things that have been in consciousness and left consciousness, and things that have been outside of consciousness that can enter consciousness. That dark space on the stage, and then, of course, in the wings, is what we're talking about when we're talking about the unconscious, okay? We're not talking about unconsciousness in terms of like being knocked out. We are rather talking about the unconscious, all the things that are not currently inside your sphere of awareness. Okay, now that in and of itself sets up an interesting set of questions, okay? So the Freudian notion of the unconscious, okay, as we've already alluded to, and this is a bit of a simplification, okay, so to take it with a grain of salt. But lots of you will be familiar from Psych 100 or from other, you know, readings of interest. You'll be familiar with the idea that you know, the iceberg model, okay? So you have like a water line, you know, like here, and above the water line is the conscious mind, right? And then below the water line is the huge bulk of the iceberg, right? We all know this post-Titanic, that most of the ice is below the water. And that iceberg model of the mind is sort of integral to the Freudian model, right? And to psychodynamic models in general. Most of your mind is actually under the water line. It's mostly unconscious, right? It's just this tiny little thing at the surface, consciousness, although consciousness always thinks it's running the show. So, okay, so that's sort of integral. But then if you look at the Freudian model, sort of past that, what you see is a model that is in some sense hydraulic, okay? What do I mean by this? So again, a simplification, but you can look at the Freudian model as being sort of a three-part system in some ways, okay? You've got the ego in the center. What's the ego? Well, the ego is your regular consciousness. It's what you identify as yourself, okay? Your regular consciousness, just you, right? Underneath your ego, you've got the id. And what's the id? The id is all of these sort of appetites and impulses, right? It's lust, it's hunger, it's violence, it's all the animal impulses, right? Do it, right? It'll feel good. Okay, I don't know why I always do that voice, but I always do that voice. Anyway, okay, and then top down, right? That's sort of bottom up, trying to push on the ego. Top down in the Freudian system, you've got the superego. And the superego is, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. This is nice, that's not nice. People don't behave that way, you do behave that way. It's kind of a scold. scolds, right? It also urges you to good behavior. This is the way to be. This is your best behavior. So the superego you internalize from culture, from your parents, right? It's this, and it's exerting pressure on the ego from the top. The id, meanwhile, is coming up and being like, do it, it'll feel good, from the bottom. Okay, and the ego is like in a tug of war between these things. It's a bit of a simplification, but essentially speaking, that's, a relative description of the Freudian model. Okay, now in that model, things within that Freudian system that become unconscious usually become so because of repression, okay? There are other mechanisms, but by and large, okay? So it's things that were considered to be unsuitable for consciousness, right? Things that basically got, right, where the id got some grip there and we did something, but it's like not okay. And so it gets repressed, right? And that might not be even an action. It can just be a thought, right? So the classic version of this in Freud is the like idea that people have sort of sexual urges towards their parents, and that is completely like not okay. And so it gets repressed. And the only way that it can work its way back up into consciousness is by symbolically coding itself through dream, which is why every pen is not a pen and every knife is not a knife. And right, everybody is pretty much aware of the idea that, like the Freud and mother jokes and Freud and penis jokes are all kind of a piece. And it's a bit of an oversimplification. In fact, a lot of an oversimplification, to be fair. Freud had some excellent ideas. But the point is that it's this repressive mechanism. That is not necessarily so for the Jungian unconscious. So the Jungian unconscious is more complex than that, right? As I've already mentioned. And there are sort of other structures. So one big distinction, okay, if the Freudian mechanism is essentially hydraulic, right? Top down, bottom up, right? Caught in the middle, this tug of war, it's hydraulic, it's mechanical in a way. The Jungian system is dynamical insofar as it's a living system. Now again, in a way, this shouldn't surprise us. The parts of our body are alive. If your heart is not alive, you're in trouble, right? Yes, it's part of you as an organism, but it is itself alive, right? Your lungs are alive, right? Your skin is alive. If any of these things are not alive, you've got trouble. Various parts of your brain are alive. If they're not alive, you've got trouble. In the Jungian system, the various parts of your mind are alive. And what that means isn't just that they're, it's not just that they, that they have the sort of a token status as being alive. It means that like other living things, they have developmental dynamics, okay, developmental dynamics. But it also means that, like I mentioned, they partake of a certain note of agency and action, right? That they do things actively. So here is a metaphor that I sometimes like to use. In a way, material in the unconscious, okay, in the Freudian system is like losing your phone in the couch, okay? So you're sitting on your friend's couch or your couch, right? And you become aware, as we horrifyingly do, that you don't have your phone, right? Oh God, where's my phone? Okay, now you might have your friend call the phone and then you hear the phone, right? And it's like, what do? You pull the cushions off the couch, you stick your hand in there, and there's all the like loose change and the cotton candy and whatever. Not cotton candy, candy corn. No, that's something else too. Like candy popcorn. Anyway, gross things. You reach your hand in and there's your phone. Now, the important thing here is like they can ring your phone to give you a sense of where it is, but where is your phone in this system? It's exactly where you left it. It fell out of your pocket and it fell into the cushions and it was there. If you had left for 4 days and come back, it would still be there, right where you left it. It's not going anywhere. It's not acting in and of itself, right? Down there. Okay, that's a very different circumstance than if you're sitting on the couch with somebody else and you hear a mouse behind the couch, okay? Why? Well, if you've ever had the pleasure of living with mice, and I have a couple of times, something I never intend to repeat again, at least maybe if they were pets, but certainly not if they're free range. Yeah, if you've ever had the pleasure of living with mice, you'll know that they make these little noises, right? They'll chew on stuff and skitter and stuff. You hear a mouse, right, behind your sofa, right? You and your friend jump up. Now, if you hear that and you pull the sofa out, where's the mouse? It's gone, right? It's not there. When you pull the couch out, the moose, it's gone. Why? Because it's actively evading you. Because it's actively evading you. Because it has its own goals and interests. It doesn't want to be found. It doesn't want to be caught, right? That, indeed, is why, among other reasons, and this is, of course, obviously also true in the Freudian system or any system, this is one of the real values of being in therapy, seeing an analyst, right? Is that, you know, aside from the fact that it's extremely hard to pick up these patterns in oneself a lot of the time, right? Having these insights, it's often striking, right? And in after the fact, quite obvious. You know, your analyst, your therapist will say, well, have you ever noticed this, that, this? Like you've mentioned your mother 7 times in the past 20 minutes. And you're like, did I? Right? Or you're like, oh my God, I did. Right? So they're sort of patterns of insight that they can offer stepping outside your situation. And this is a bit like the mouse and the couch, right? Your therapist is sort of standing at the other end. When you pull the couch, there's somebody else there ready to catch it because it will actively evade you. So that's an important distinction with the Jungian system. In the Jungian system of psychodynamics, right, the contents and structures of the unconscious are alive, right? They have their own goals, their own purposes, their own, right? And again, like other systems, sometimes they're working together, sometimes they're working at cross purposes, and sometimes they don't even know. Like 2 systems can not even be aware of each other. That can be its own set of problems. Okay, so that's a little bit about the unconscious, sort of generally speaking. Now, when we're talking about the Jungian system, it's important to get a sense that Jung is talking not just about the personal unconscious, but also about the collective unconscious. Okay, what do I mean here? Okay, so your personal unconscious, right, is all of the material that resides in your unconscious. That's not especially helpful. But what do I mean by this? That Jung proposed that there was also a collective component to the unconscious, that is a shared layer of the unconscious. Now, what might that look like? Okay, so we already talked about left and right-handedness, okay? So left and right-handedness are interesting as an example of this because 90% of the population across the globe are right-handed, right? There are some small variations depending by certain populations and things, but by and large, this seems to be sort of genetically determined that 90% of people are right-handed. Consequently, in basically every culture on Earth, there is a set of associations with right-handed and left-handed. And apologies in advance to the people who are left-handed, right? Okay, right is often seen, if not quite as good, as like trustworthy and skillful. And left is not quite trustworthy, right? It's a little like maybe deceptive, maybe, right? Hard to read, not quite trustworthy. Okay, let's think about this for a second. If you're right-handed, and I am, if you need to do something, you're probably doing it with your right hand. You need to use a pen, you're gonna use your right hand. You need to use a hammer, you're gonna use your right hand. Tool, right hand. Handshake, right hand, right? Your right hand is the one you trust. Why? Because it's skillful. It is, and the Latin word in this case, dexter. It is dexterous, right? Skillful, skillful. Your left hand, by comparison, it's like, it's a backup hand, right? If you're right-handed, it's a backup hand. You don't trust it to write things. You don't trust it to engage in skilled tasks. You trust it to like steady things, hold things that hold stuff maybe, but like you don't trust it to do skilled tasks most of the time. Interestingly, in Latin, the word for left is sinister. So dexter, like dexterous, sinister, like sinister, like sinister, right? Okay, that's basically a universal cultural association. Almost every culture has that. You can see how that would be a bit biologically grounded, but let's look at another one. In basically every culture, up is good, down is bad. So the idea that heaven is in the sky and hell is beneath you is pretty much a cultural universal. Okay, up good, down bad, right? Now, again, you can find some sort of biological and evolutionary reasons that that might be the case, right? So yeah, sure, if you're standing upright, you're healthy, and if you're on the ground, that's not so good. You're either sick or vulnerable. If you've got the high ground, sorry, I had a flashback to Star Wars. If you've got the high ground, right, you're in a strategically advantageous position, right? You know, up, to be above is better. We work it into our sense of status even, right? To be high on the hill, right? King of the hill, as it were. Our sense of status is also based in height. And that's a cultural universal. Up, good, down, bad, right? Okay. But even above that, you know, even above that kind of thing, there are some kinds of cultural universals, which, if you think about it, are really, really sort of striking. So all human languages, okay, are all constituted according to the same kind of grammatical structures. These are genetic, okay? So we learn different languages, and the content of those languages, right, is often gives us a radically different set of paints, right, a palette to paint our experience. But the basic structures that underlie it are shared. Any human being transplanted into any other language environment as an infant can pick up that language. The basic structures of it are shared. Here's another interesting example, and this one will push things hopefully a little bit further for you. If you take a human infant who has never otherwise been exposed to it, and you show a human infant, right, of an age where they can like focus their eyes and stuff, you show a human infant the silhouette of a spider, they will instinctively recoil with harm. Now, those of you who, of course, track genetics and you know, sort of, you know, evolutionary biology, right, and evolutionary psychology would be like, well, yeah, that makes sense. We're descended from tree-dwelling creatures, and probably all of the babies that smiled and cooed and, you know, were like, ooh, look, a spider, right, didn't do that well, because for a small child, even a spider bite that would be considered not especially problematic for a full-grown adult could kill them, right? So that's like a pretty good candidate for, you know, a genetic hard coding as a threat. And similarly, right, organisms respond to snakes and things. But for human beings, okay, there's no question, infants react to this spider silhouette. But what I want you to consider for a second is what that means. Because what it means is that an infant who has never otherwise had an encounter, may have never maybe seen a spider before at all, has an instinctive response, like a reflex reaction to a pattern in the world, which connotes a certain kind of organism and connotes threat. And we're not talking about like a startled response, like being puffed in the eye, right? You've ever had that blink response, right? Where they puff you in the eye and you, right? You can't help but kind of be startled and blink. It doesn't, you can prepare yourself for it, it doesn't matter. It's not like that. We're talking about a shape, right? We're talking about a shape, and the shape carries with it an emotion, okay? That's a structure shared by every human being, okay? So when Jung is talking about the collective unconscious, part of what he's talking about is this shared set of structures. And that's just a jumping off point, okay? We're gonna talk about this in more detail because Jung's interest gradually turned towards other commonalities that he saw between, right, between humans all over the world, okay? Now, I don't want to downplay the role of culture and individuality. Those things are enormously important, okay? However, I am going to say that the stance generally, okay, for understanding this material, I think it's useful, is to understand that any two humans have massively more in common than they have different. It's not that those differences aren't relevant, okay? The differences between men and women, the differences between different ethnic groups, the differences between different cultures, sexual orientations, right? All the various, right, pieces of intersectionality, okay, religion, etc. Differences matter, and they can matter deeply to experience. But the point is, those differences are always outweighed by commonalities, right? Always massively outweighed in aggregate by commonalities, right? You can take an infant from any culture, bring them to another culture at a certain age, they'll just pick up the language, right? That ability is innate, even though the languages and the cultures might be different. Now, we tend, like Jungians and Freudians or Irish and English, to focus on the differences, okay? But the point is that the commonalities actually are a huge point of reference. And it was by and large those kinds of commonalities that Jung was interested in when he was talking about the collective unconscious. So in a way, you can think about it like this. The personal unconscious, right? That field of material that you have that's just you in your life, that's composed of all of these aspects of your particular intersectionality, okay? You know, your ethnic background, your sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, all these different things, your family, right, is going to bring with it a certain set of features, right, within your personal unconscious. Okay, and then below that is like a broader set of features that you're going to share culturally with the people around you, right? You know, if you hang around with people from your culture and you hang around with people from other cultures, it rapidly becomes clear, and in the best cases, it's kind of fun and funny, right? What those differences are, right? The little things that you don't really take for granted, but that you share in common, right? So there is a layer that you have in common with the rest of your culture in terms of the unconscious. But then beneath that is this fully collective version of the unconscious, right? And that's shared with all human beings, right? And it was those features that Jung became interested in when he was looking at mythology, the way that that level of shared collective unconscious worked its way up into particular versions within different cultures and persons, okay? So that's sort of a useful way to think about it. Now, there's a few different ways to look at the collective unconscious. You know, one is that, you know, we all have a copy of the same collective unconscious. We each get a copy of it, okay? That's one way to look at it. In some of the later work, it seems as though Jung is talking about it in a different way, as though we are literally sharing in some way the same collective unconscious. Like, you know, you drill a well on your property and your neighbor drills a well on their property. If you both drilled down into a common reservoir of water and you like dropped a fish down your well, it could swim up your neighbor's well. Sometimes in his late work, it seems as though Jung is talking about the unconscious in that way. Now, that's pretty far out for a lot of people because it seems to imply things about reality that are not what most of us would commonly hold, right? You know, it sort of lets like telepathy in the back door and a few things like that, right? We'll talk about that later, but not too much. The core thing that we need to sort of nail down is really this idea that there is a common base, right? And if you want to think about it as a copy, that's one way that Jung thought about it, okay? That you have a personal copy of this sort of human inheritance, okay, of psychic structure. Okay, now, in all these multiple recordings, I've only left myself 3 minutes to talk about the structure of the psyche such as it is. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give myself much more time to upload these recordings. I do apologize. I'm a bit red-faced about the whole thing. I mean, I'm mostly red-faced. I'm a pretty pink guy, but I'm a bit red-faced about this. I don't know why I've been having the technical difficulties I have, but there you go. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of a preview. Next time, we're going to start talking about the specifics of the Jungian psyche. Now, a thing that I want you to remember before we get into this, and I'll use the same diagram next time, is the map is not the territory. Jung was very clear about this. People always wanted to take the different ideas that he had about these structures in the unconscious, okay, and like produce a diagram. Here's what it is. Here are all the parts, and they're all labeled, and this is what it looks like. Good, right? No, ignore that impulse. We will provide diagrams because they're sort of a useful shorthand, but that's all. Don't mistake the diagram for the reality. Things are more complicated than that. So the diagram is just a shorthand. It just serves as a way to talk about the relationship between the parts a little bit, but don't mistake the diagram, right, for sort of the reality of it. And don't think that because something doesn't appear on the diagram, that means that it's not there, right? So this is a bit of a simplification. Okay, so with 1.5 minutes left, let's take a look here. So here is the map I like to use, okay? And I like to use it for this course. The reason I like to use this particular diagram is it's different than the one that you see a lot of the time. You can see there are different relationships. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to start to get into this, okay? The relationship between the inner and outer world, okay? The relationship between the ego and the shadow, how those things are compensatory for each other. The relationship between the persona, the mask that you wear, and your contrasexual soul image, right? The animus anima, which is your relationship to your inner self. The collective and personal unconscious to some extent, right? But then also talking about the other archetypes, okay? Archetypes, which we'll get into, the archetypes and complexes that sort of one encounters, and then finally, the encounter with the self. We're going to get into all of that in the next lecture, okay, in some detail, and much more detail as we go through the course, obviously. And then also next lecture, it looks like we will be going through some of the stuff on function theory. Okay, so this is where introversion, extroversion, right? And some of you, well, I'll assign kind of an MBTI thing, which you can try if you've never tried it. Okay, so that was a lot of multiple hassles. Sorry for the hassle on your side. I'll see you tonight. It's a frightening noise. I hate it.